Hello, everyone, my friends at LinkedIn. Really happy to be here today for the first time on behalf of the Amedea Pharma company page. My name is Tim Mikhelishvili. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Amedea Pharma, an analytics and organizational change consulting company that focuses on life sciences and healthcare. So I'm pleased to welcome many of you. Today, I'm going to be presenting the results of a global study that I conducted in November of 2020, in the height of the pandemic, when I surveyed a lot of my global colleagues in pharma, in medical devices, and the pharmaceutical industry in Australia, in Middle East, working remotely for at least 50% of the time. And I'm going to share a lot of these results, which I just presented in Chicago on June 20th, in fact. But I think that they have a lot of important implications for many of you who are joining now, who may not be working in the pharmaceutical industry and who are working remotely. And so I'm really excited about sharing with you some of these results, and also looking forward to hearing your suggestions because I plan to conduct a phase 2 of this study. So please make sure to comment. We're live right now on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on YouTube as well. And so I'm looking forward again to really understanding how we can do deep work, right? And not just work, but have a flow, right, of work. And so that's how I define deep work, right? Which we're all becoming somewhat conscious of, given just how much time we spend in virtual meetings, going from one meeting to the next without many breaks, or the ability to really reflect on what we have learned, what we need to learn and teach others, as well as how to be more productive and more focused, have more energy to finish those projects before we move on to the next, and to prioritize accordingly. So these are some of the questions in this puzzle that we're all trying to solve today. So we started to ask these questions in the form of a 10-question survey that took only 1 minute to complete. And so this is the poster, the snapshot of the poster that was just presented in Chicago, and which I'm going to go into much more detail right now. And so I've invited to this live stream many of those friends of mine who participated in the study, whom I'm very grateful to, because they were busy enough trying to navigate the new environment, the pandemic, and all the risks associated with travel and so forth. Yet they found the time to support me, and I thank all of you for that. And so the objective of this study, which I call the Virtual Productivity Threshold study, was to really evaluate whether or not there was a limit or a threshold that was driven by a correlation or a relationship between the number of virtual meetings per day, or the break time intervals between them, and our self-assessed deep work, energy, attention, and productivity. Okay, and so what was the rationale for this study? And I alluded to this already. Of course, we are now somewhat becoming more accustomed and becoming pros at facilitating and participating in virtual meetings. But during that time, in the fall of 2020, there were new reports of Zoom fatigue, for example, energy depletion. People felt like they were constantly performing, and when they were on virtual meetings, which took a toll over time, and it was cumulative, over time. Well, some companies adjusted very quickly. Microsoft, Google, JP Morgan, Amazon, they instituted new vacation policies and even had no meetings weeks with no virtual meetings at all. And now, what were the results of some of these policies? Well, some of the unlimited vacation policies actually led to less vacation days requested and led to higher productivity. There's research that demonstrates that as well. Now, some of the more recent surveys are clearly confirming the preference that all of us have for having more flexible work schedules, working remotely at least one day of the week. The UK has now already implemented a 4-day week. They're experimenting with it. 40% of employees also even went as far as saying that they would quit a job that required full-time in-person work. And so we have gotten very accustomed to this virtual environment, virtual meetings, which may be specific to certain industries versus others, which may be more relevant in certain industries than others, of course. But the overwhelming prediction now is that about 20% of all US workdays will be conducted remotely once the pandemic ends. And so, one big, I think, an important takeaway here, and really the part of the rationale for this study, is that our business expectations and our metrics, as well as the outcomes, are directly influenced by two factors: by the norms of our communication and by the workflow that we create ourselves. And so that really was one of the impetus for this study, right? That we have to be a little bit more conscious about how we communicate and we collaborate in terms of the culture that we create through every meeting. Because remember, the culture, organizational change, and company culture begins between two people in one meeting, right? And so these meetings, when they're amplified and when they're replicated over time and time again, they create a particular culture and norms. And so we may have to rethink these norms. Okay. And ultimately, it's not just the number of these meetings, but probably the format, how we facilitate virtual meetings, how frequent they are, how long they last, as well as the impact on creativity. And I've spoken about this in my previous lives here on LinkedIn, where I demonstrated this study, which was just published recently by Melanie Brooks and Jonathan Levov, which demonstrated that virtual communication may curb creative idea generation because we are so focused on each other, according to these eye movement tests that they conducted in these experiments, that we do not really get influenced or inspired by cues around us, cues in the environment. We don't move as much. We're too close to the computer, right? In order to be able to and we focus on each other. So that may actually decrease our creativity. Okay. And so those are some of the interesting findings that I think are still need to be explored in terms of how to become more productive as well as more creative. But my study really measured self-assessed productivity, or self-assessed, self-reported deep work. Okay. And so this was a 1-minute, 10-question online survey that people received at the same time, at the end of their business day in local time, for 14 consecutive days, including weekends. And they reported a wide range of activities that they participated in: virtual meetings, the duration of the break time intervals between them, their self-assessed energy, attention, deep work, and the extent to which they felt like they accomplished their goals, as well as other variables, secondary variables, such as the sleep quality the previous night and exercise as well. And so this is what the online survey looked like. Again, it included scales of 0 to 10. in order to rate their levels of attention or energy or other variables that I mentioned. With the highest numerical value, of course, corresponding to the highest level of attention or deep work. They weren't defined strictly. They were just defined across along that continuum. The statisticians in the study, they conducted an analysis, they started by a multiple linear regression test, both for virtual meetings as well as break times between them, in order to understand whether or not there was any significant correlation. So the function of these multivariate regression tests were just to see whether or not there was any significant correlation first before going on and then testing each pairs of these correlations individually. And it turned out that there was indeed a significant correlation based on these multiple linear regression tests, which was encouraging to find. And so then we delved a little bit deeper, and we wanted to see whether or not there was any particular virtual productivity threshold. Was there a particular limit or number of virtual meetings that conferred a loss of productivity? And so we tested whether or not that number of virtual meetings per day was 3. Is that virtual productivity threshold 3 days, for example? And I want to post this question to all of you who are tuning in as well. Please feel free to share your comments. Once I finish this presentation, I'll ask for your suggestions as well and comments. And so we tested that through a post hoc analysis. And I'm going to show you the results as well in the subsequent slides. Of course, there was a statistical significance between weekdays and weekends, where there were significantly more break times between virtual meetings on the weekends, and also less virtual meetings on the weekends, as would be expected. On the left, you have the breakdown of the number of responses that I received, and I received 271 responses over 14 days. Most of the responses came from Monday and Monday, Wednesday. As you can see, there were more responses received from the weekdays compared to the weekends. And so these two complicated looking graphs are those Spearman correlations that tested any correlation between any of these pairs of variables. Since we already had determined that there was a significant correlation overall based on the multilinear regression tests, we then started to look more individually at these pairs. So these are the results of the first model, the first linear regression model, that shows that the day, the sleep, as well as deep work contributed to that significant correlation between virtual meetings and those variables that we tested. You can also see here that the attention level approached significance, as denoted by the p-value of 0.09, which didn't really mean statistical significance at 0.05 or less, but it was nevertheless, it trended in that direction. And so the second regression model on break time intervals also again showed that the day, right, the difference between the weekend and weekdays, as well as deep work, self-reported deep work, seemed to stand out and seemed to correlate with the duration of those break time intervals between virtual meetings. Now, once we look at the individual variables in more detail, we see a modest correlation, a negative correlation between virtual meetings and deep work, meaning the more virtual meetings in which we engage per day, the less deep work, deep uninterrupted work that we engage, or that flow, right? So when we think of the workflow that we create, all of us do work, but not all of us find the flow. And so that's why I had this image here, this definition that I shared with you, to really understand and break down workflow, and understand just how productive we are throughout the day. And so that's what this survey exercise really allowed a lot of the participants to do. And I look forward to hearing from all of you about this. But certainly, those comments in a follow-up survey that we conducted were clear, that people appreciated the exercise, really to reflect on their day, and on in detail as well, in terms of how many meetings they had, what their calendar really helped them to determine, right, at the end of the day. And so here you can see that the deep work stood out in terms of the number of minutes of deep work, of uninterrupted work, and number of virtual meetings. And when you looked at all the different variables tested, the top 5 correlations are listed on the table in the right, in the green, between attention and energy, attention and productivity. So these are the variables that I have extracted out of those 2 tables, those 2 large tables, as the biggest correlate, the top 5 correlations. And notice deep work and attention also were correlated significantly, as expected, based on the attention and the p-value that approached the significance with attention level. And this the differences here may have been in how people perceived or defined these terms, right? There's a lot of overlap between, of course, the deep work and attention, for example, right? And the productivity, the way that question was phrased was, to what extent did you feel like you accomplished your goals at the end of the day, right? So that was, it was also, it seemed to correlate with attention, with other variables, but based on the multilinear regression tests, that productivity was not what was statistically significant. And so these findings here are exploratory, that we can explore in future studies. Maybe we can ask questions that define productivity differently, or energy. We can hone in on energy, for example. But these tables here indicate the relationship between break time intervals, the breaks between virtual meetings, and deep work. And again, it was really the deep work that, as expected, was positive, had the highest correlation coefficient, which was modest. Okay. And so here is the one interesting finding as a post hoc analysis that we did, where among the 271 responses that we received, we divided them based on those who engaged in less than 3 versus more than 3 or more virtual meetings per day. And it looks like there was quite a statistically significant difference, with 50% longer time spent in deep uninterrupted work among those employees who had less than 3 virtual meetings per day. And that translated into more than 25 additional minutes per day of uninterrupted work. So what really does that mean over time? Over a period of a week, over a period of a month, or over a year? That could mean a lot more statistically significant, or impactful productivity, additional productivity that may translate into business, into increased sales, increased leads, educational opportunities. And so 3 virtual meetings per day may be that virtual productivity threshold. And so this is, a finding that we can probably explore further in the future studies. Please comment and let me know what your virtual productivity threshold is. Now, we collected some feedback from those who participated in the survey as well. And here are some of the testimonies that are verbatim. Okay. First, the first question assessed the personal impact. How did the survey really impact the participants personally? And so I alluded to this earlier, in that those of you, and many of you are watching this live here, you felt like you were more conscious, right? You were more critical on how productive you were. Now, notice the second comment, that back-to-back virtual meetings did not give me time to re-energize and refocus, unlike face-to-face meetings, for which I could prepare even during a drive. So that time that you need to re-energize is what I wanted to assess in measuring the break time intervals. And this is why I think the regeneration of energy and focus in this virtual digital environment is critical, I think, on our productivity, which is evident in these comments. And so here's one participant who says that I was more productive and had more uninterrupted focus on the days when I had more breaks. And so there was a correlation that the study confirmed, right, between both virtual meetings and break time. Now, was there a pattern that people observed themselves in addition to the responses to the questions that were predetermined? Well, of course, there was more of accountability, but notice that one of the testimonies here actually spelled out that number, this VPT of 3 virtual meetings per day, right? That they noticed that when they had more than 3 virtual meetings per day, even though they had many accomplishments, they felt extremely fatigued, despite good sleep as well. Okay, and so the questions on the physical toll that virtual meetings impact, the other variables, sleep, the exercise, are also probably ones to consider. But however, they really seemed to pick up on the variable of deep uninterrupted work, as you can see by the last comment on the bottom here, that it was that uninterrupted work that predicted their sense of productivity at the end of the day. And so in the future, they provided one suggestion, that the content of that virtual meeting, maybe the number of people that participate in that virtual meeting also, or a valid reason for that meeting, as well as a simple check-in, made that difference in terms of going from one virtual meeting to the next, and distinguishing between them. Then looking ahead to future studies, here were some of the suggestions from many of you who are on this LinkedIn Live as well. Number one, to use specifically defined scales, like a Likert scale, that actually defines maybe a shorter scale than 0 to 10, but a Likert scale from 1 to 5, lowest energy, defining 5 as highest energy, for example. And also extend the survey to non-pharma, those who are predominantly working remotely. Capturing more details, as we mentioned earlier, right? More details on the nature of the virtual meetings, types of activities during breaks. How do people regenerate their focus, their energy? And one interesting suggestion was to waive the restriction to submit responses the same day. because I instituted a very um, strict requirement in the survey where the participants were required to submit their responses by the end of that business day, before midnight, in order to reduce any recall bias. And so that's the relevance of that last comment. So what have I learned from this VPT study? Well, there seems to be a correlation between our deep work and the number of virtual meetings in which we participate, as well as the break time intervals. The shorter the break time intervals, the less deep work that we do. And when these virtual meetings approach 3 or more, there may indeed be this limit, this potential virtual productivity threshold. And so I think we need to explore this further and find what that specific virtual productivity threshold is. However, I think that we need to I need to explore in more detail than a 1-minute survey would allow to understand the nature of those meetings in order to plan our norms of to plan and design our norms of communication and our norms of virtual engagement internally as well as externally with customers as well. And I think there is a need that this study reminds us, the need in increasing deep work by really reassessing the workflow, what workflow really means. Because again, as I mentioned, I think we create our own workflow and our norms of communication. And that needs to be revisited in order to be more productive, and hopefully in future surveys to follow up on the Nature Journal article by Melanie Brooks and actually study not just the virtual productivity, but also virtual creativity. And so that's some of my interest to understand how we're able to generate ideas and be productive, because our creativity also, I think, impacts our productivity. And again, I'll remind you that this is the first LinkedIn Live from the Amedea Pharma company page on LinkedIn. Make sure to follow Amedea Pharma on LinkedIn. There are 3 core strategies at Amedea Pharma, which is, again, a metrics and culture consulting company, if you will, bringing together these 2 concepts that are often separated, helping organizations to both quantify and combine technical performance with organizational behaviors, which are ever so relevant, related, and critical. And so the 3 strategies, again, that you can see a lot of posts and information on the Amedea Pharma blog on the company page are: number 1, changing norms of communication and collaboration; number 2, designing metrics that inspire future behaviors rather than past activities; and then thirdly, building branded learning and development communities. So thank you very much for your attention, my friends. Share this if you found this useful. And I hope to see you next time. And next time, I'll just preview the next session on Amedea Pharma. I'll be talking about deep metrics in our digital era, translating attention into context and community, which will be essentially an encore presentation from the one that I delivered recently in May 25th at the second annual Digital Transformation Summit in Philadelphia, where we had many discussions that followed. And I hope to engage many of you here on LinkedIn as well, where we can also connect virtually as well as in person as a follow-up. So thank you very much for your attention. Have a great rest of the day, my friends. Thank you, Bowo. Thanks for your support and for your following. Thanks, everyone.